Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. And for anyone who jumps on late, that's totally fine. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Massey. I'm the Executive Director of the UNO Alumni Association. Thank you so much for joining us today. As an association, we've been trying to offer programming and content for our alumni base that's both informative, sometimes fun. We're rolling out these webinars as part of our larger virtual Meet Us At series. And we're really excited for the topic today. We have two of our esteemed faculty, Dr. Sarah Black and Dr. Elliot Beaton from the Department of Psychology joining us. They're going to be talking with us today about the psychological impacts of COVID-19 and the quarantine as it relates to adolescent populations as well as those coexisting with the adolescent populations, particularly with regards to past traumas. So that's the particular topic today, but I'm going to hand it over to them to talk a little bit more about their work in general. They'll go on to proceed with the presentation. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. They'll be taking a few pauses throughout the hour to answer your questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the interim chair of our Department of Psychology at UNO, Dr. Elliot Beaton. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks to all of you for tuning in today and for your support of UNO. The Alumni Association is a very important part of our organization, and we really appreciate you for all that you do. So I just want to briefly just tell you a little bit about the department. Maybe you're already familiar with what we do. We have a very unique program in that we have a graduate level program. We have a really strong undergraduate program as well. And our graduate program is in applied psychology. And essentially what that means is we're very interested in looking at really science-based methods to help understand human behavior, mental illness, and how to attenuate those things and how to learn where the origins of those things are from, and how we can ultimately help people. And so, so I want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we do. The overarching theme of most of the research by our faculty is in the area of developmental psychopathology, meaning we're trying to understand what are the origins of mental health issues, often looking in childhood, even infancy, but throughout childhood, in adolescence, and emerging adulthood, and beyond. And so the reason I tell you this is because it might give you some background as to why Dr. Black and I were quite interested in this topic in terms of stress. So in my research, I'm the head of a laboratory called the Stress, Cognition, and Affective Neuroscience Laboratory, and we're very interested in what contributes to the development of adult mental illness in children that are at ultra high risk for developing things like psychosis, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, and so on. And so the children that we often study have medical or genetic disorders that predispose them to having lots of other issues. And then, of course, we're interested in how stress affects things like emotionality, emotional development, even our immune function, and so forth. And in my laboratory, we do brain imaging, we do measurements of hormones, we do measurements of immunology, we do physiological measurements, and we take this whole cornucopia of methods in an intersectional way to understand patterns of development, to try to determine who might be at more risk or might be at less risk, and how can we intervene. And so one of the things that I wanted to tell you all about psychology in general is that it's really a modern science, right? So we think about psychology as dream interpretation and sitting on sofas, but really it's a method, all these complex, really medical methods and technological methods that we use to understand really what we think is the most complicated thing that we know about in the known universe, humans know about, is the human brain. So that's a little bit about what we do and a pitch for our department. And if you'd like to learn more about our department, we're more than happy to answer questions about that after the presentation as well. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Black.
Great, thank you so much, Elliot. So my name is Sarah Black. I'm an assistant professor in the psychology department at UNO. I've been at UNO since about 2018. And my area of research so I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and my area of research is aimed at trying to understand risk factors for depression and other sort of affective illness in children and adolescents. So as Elliot mentioned, as a department, we take developmental psychopathology approach. And so what, part of what that means is also that we're trying to understand what can go wrong in development that can lead some people to be more at risk while other people are not at risk. And so I'm very interested in a couple of main areas here. I'm really interested in hormone functioning and specifically puberty. So sort of what happens during puberty. Most people recognize this as a time of a lot of emotional upheaval and a lot of changes. But most people get through it relatively unscathed. And so I'm interested in understanding what are some of the emotional and physiological changes that go along with puberty that might lead some people to be more at risk than others. The other area of interest I have is understanding parent-child relationships and how they may also lead to increased risk for certain kinds of psychopathology, especially depression. So one of the lines of research that I'm currently conducting is looking at something called attunement, which is basically how in sync parents and children are, both psychologically and emotionally, but also chemically and physiologically. So, are their hormones in tune as well? And so, with regard to the current topic today, Elliot and I are going to be telling you a little bit more about quarantine and the effects of quarantine on parents and children. And then at the end, we'll tell you a little bit about a project that we're working on now, which really kind of builds from both of our areas of research, especially because this pandemic, as I'm sure everybody is intimately familiar, is a stressful life experience at a scale that most of us have not seen before. And so, we're really interested in how that is affecting families and children, especially in New Orleans and the greater New Orleans area at this time. Okay. So I think now I will move to a brief presentation that we have. And again, if you have questions or anything during the presentation, please don't hesitate to let us know. So I think, is that visible to everyone? Yes? Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you, Elliot, for the feedback. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the psychological impacts of the COVID-19 quarantine. As Rachel mentioned, so we are going to talk about children and how they're affected, but the overall sort of message or the overall sort of idea of this talk is, how does this impact people in general? Did someone just advance that? Or did that just advance itself?
It's a ghost.
It's a ghost.
Ghost in the machine. It's a ghost in the machine.
Well, it was an appropriate time to advance the slide, so I suppose that's fine. So just sort of a word on terms before we get going. So, we're kind of throwing around a lot of terms during this event. So we talk a lot about quarantine. Currently, Louisiana has a stay-at-home order. Other states have a shelter-in-place order. And then there's also isolation. So just to sort of clarify what we're talking about here, isolation is defined as, this is sort of the highest level, the most restriction. And this is where somebody has been exposed to a virus, in this case, COVID-19, and they have tested positive for that virus. And so isolation procedures are put in place in order to prevent them from transmitting the illness to people, to other people. And so what this typically looks like is, even within a home, you may see that an individual who's experiencing the illness, who has tested positive for it, may be separated to a one room, right? They're not having any contact even with their family members. Quarantine is sort of a level below that, a little bit less restrictive. And this is where people have been exposed to the illness and they may or may not test positive for it, but they're advised to stay in their home. And so in these cases, people aren't always, advised to stay by themselves, right? They can still interact with their families usually, or people that live in their home, but they're discouraged from leaving their homes. They're really encouraged to stay, sort of in the house and not go out. And then stay-at-home and shelter-in-place orders, which Louisiana and New Orleans are currently under, are the least restrictive, although still pretty restrictive. And these are, for these measures, basically people are being asked to only leave their homes when absolutely necessary. So leave homes for things like going to the pharmacy, the grocery store, to get exercise, things like that. So just, I think that it's important as it just did it again. Okay.
That's weird.
It is kind of strange. In any event, it seems to be working out though. So anyway, okay. So either way, I think it's important to make sure that we're using the right terms, and especially as scientists, we want to always be really precise in the way that we use terms. However, what all of these things have in common is that there is an intense potential for psychological distress. And so there have been some actually late-breaking research studies that have just come out that have demonstrated, excuse me, I'm sorry. Sorry, I was about to sneeze. Anyway, it might come back. Oh, this is such inconvenient timing. Anyway, so they have the potential for psychological distress. So some of these late-breaking studies that have come out have looked at sort of large samples and how they may, so sorry.
It's Murphy's Law.
I'm really
go sneeze in the crook of your arm, Sarah. Don't use your hands.
Oh my God.
Put a mask on.
I hope so. Okay. So some of the psychological distress that we've seen from other research studies looking at quarantine, they've seen psychological outcomes such as increases in rates of depression and anxiety, increases in rates of post-traumatic stress, not necessarily the full disorder, but certainly having some of those symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress. And then also we see things like anger and confusion and physical effects such as insomnia. So we know that quarantine and isolation processes have a negative impact on our mental health.
Now, it didn't do it when you wanted to do it.
Now it didn't. There we go.
There we go.
The thing about these, so why do we even have these, conditions in place, right? If it's so bad for us in terms of our mental health, why would we do it? Well, it's really effective. So what we know is, many of you, if not all of you, I'm sure are very familiar with this image, and this is a representation of what we're calling flattening the curve, right? And so the idea is that all of these measures, these isolation, quarantine, stay-at-home order measures, are put in place despite how painful they are because it's for the safety of the public, right? And they are working, right? We're seeing evidence that cities and states that are using these kinds of measures are seeing sort of that their rates of COVID-19 are either not increasing as quickly or are actually starting to decrease. And so the measures are really effective, but they are painful. And so I think that really as researchers who are interested in stress, that lends investigators like Elliot and I to want to know, what can we do about this? How can we mitigate some of these effects? So the first thing is to understand what it is about quarantine that gets under our skin like this, right? So why is it that it's so frustrating? And this is where, and we all have anecdotal, evidence, right? This is the thing that I hate about quarantine, or this is the thing that I hate about quarantine. But looking at some of these larger scale research studies, we can get sort of more sort of broad and representative information about what is generally the most troubling aspect of quarantine and isolation. So this is probably no surprise to anyone out there, but the things that this particular analysis found that led to negative outcomes in quarantine were things like frustration, boredom, not having enough supplies or information during the quarantine and isolation periods, financial loss and the associated anxiety that comes with that, fears of infection, and then the duration of the quarantine. And with, perhaps unsurprisingly, the research finding that the longer the quarantine, the greater the negative effects and the greater the risk for negative effects. So now that we know what we're dealing with, the next step is to develop strategies to start to address these factors. So how can we sort of take some of the sting out of what is naturally, an unnatural experience? Excuse me. So I think one of the most important strategies, it's easier said than done, but it's great if you can make it work, is to establish routines. So some of us are fortunate enough to still be able to work during the quarantine. And so in some ways, work sets up routines for us. We have meetings, we have deadlines, we have things we have to do. But even in the absence of a structured job, it's really, oh boy, that was the ghost. Even in the absence of a job, I think it's important to establish routines for yourself, right? So this might be something as simple as, on the weekdays, I'm going to get up every day at 7 a.m. Not necessarily because I have something explicit I have to do at 7 a.m., but just to sort of keep myself sort of on a similar schedule. I'm going to eat lunch around the same time. I'm going to start cooking dinner around the same time. Having those kinds of routines gives us some semblance of normalcy. Something that I've been hearing from people is, oh, for heaven's sakes, oh, the days are blurring together. Like, I don't know the difference between a weekday and a weekend. That's very common, but not ideal, right? It's better if we can sort of delineate between our work days and our weekend days, right? So having those routines is important. Elliot, were you going to say something?
Yeah, Sarah, I was just going to say, maybe you want to comment too, how this is particularly important for children.
Yes, so I'm going to sort of talk about some strategies and then kind of talk about how they apply to children as well. Yeah, perfect. But yeah, that is 100% true. Children, all of these things that I'm about to talk about also apply to children in spades, for sure.
Yeah, particularly so.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, oh, for heaven. Okay. So the next thing is, and this is related to routines, but maintaining healthy eating and exercise habits. So there have been a lot of jokes and things going around about people, kind of eating, out of boredom during COVID-19 and feeling, or maybe getting like to go, takeout from a restaurant as a way to, not only deal with boredom, but also like as a treat, right? We don't have a lot of ways that we can treat ourselves right now. And that's completely fine. The important thing is to make sure that it doesn't get out of hand. And so the more that you maintain a healthy diet, make sure that you're, eating a good variety of foods, fresh vegetables, grains, things like that, all the things you should be eating, the more that your body will feel better and will be more able to deal with some of these psychological stressors. And the same thing is true of exercise. So, gyms are closed, a lot of the same things that, or a lot of the things that we used to do to exercise are no longer available to us. But just something as simple as getting out of your home and taking a walk, right? Take a 30-minute walk just to get away from your screen and get some fresh air. We've been really fortunate in Louisiana that we've had some really nice weather. So that is, I think, a really important way to sort of keep your body and your mind healthy during this challenging time. Okay, limiting screen time is another thing that's really important. Many of us, especially those of us who are still fortunate to be working, are taking all of our meetings on Zoom, right? Or on some other sort of video conferencing software. And there is some research coming out that's suggesting that this is actually, the kinds of meetings that we have over video are even more taxing than the kinds of meetings that we have in person. And so it's taking up a lot more energy to have one of these online video meetings than it would to have a regular meeting. And so I think that, and some of this is unavoidable, right? If we're still working, we have to have these meetings. We have to find a way to connect. But what that also means is that in your free time, when you don't necessarily have to be on your computer, make a concerted point to step away from your screens. Read a book, take a walk, play with your kids, something that sort of gets you away from the technology, because it can be really super draining to be, on that technology so consistently. Relatedly, another thing that's really important during these times is to keep up with our social connections. So lots of people have done some really cool, inventive things where people are playing games over Zoom, or other, video conferencing equipment. People are doing things like having dinner parties and other big get-togethers. My father told me that he went to a Zoom wedding reception not long ago. So people are definitely utilizing these softwares, which is wonderful. And, it's not the same. It is not the same as being in the same room and face-to-face with a person. But it really can, sort of help us to not feel so isolated during this time when physically we are kind of isolated. So I think, and social connections don't only have to take place via video technology, right? It can be simple as picking up a call, picking up the phone, sending a text message, writing a letter, sending an email. I mean, there's all different kinds of ways to connect with people. This especially goes for, people who, maybe who are more isolated. So if you live alone, you don't necessarily have that in-person social contact. It's especially important for you to stay connected with people. Another thing that I think is so important is to really acknowledge that this is a very strange and difficult time. It doesn't do anyone any good to pretend that this is normal. In a lot of ways, we are adjusting to this, right? People, sort of reference the new normal. And so we are adjusting because we are humans and we are adaptable, and, we can do that, which is a wonderful thing. But it is by no means a typical situation that we're in right now. And so I think that by just acknowledging that this is a strange time, that can help us to be a little bit more forgiving of ourselves if we don't always achieve what we wanted to achieve, or if we're not always perfect with our routines or our exercise and eating and things like that. I think it sort of helps us to become more compassionate towards ourselves.
Sarah, I just want to interject really quick here and mention too that these things are all interrelated, right? So for example, even the screen time aspect, if you're looking at your screen a lot, and especially prior to bedtime, that's going to be affecting your natural sleep rhythms as well, right? So all that bright light starts acting on this part of your brain called the pineal gland, and you want to maintain sort of good sleep hygiene so that you can establish those routines. So maybe you're staying up later, you find your kids are staying up later. All of these things kind of go part and parcel. Even the eating part. So when you're stressed, your body's stressed, it's responding to stress in a physiological way. And so sometimes we'll call this cortisol feeding or stress hormone feeding. It's a metabolic hormones that regulate, essentially, it's almost like the idle in your car, and so, your body, even though you may be cognitively or mentally thinking about this stuff, your body responds to it in a physical way. So your body's like, oh, things are bad times. We should eat more. We should eat more fat. We should eat more sugar. All that's kind of really, dense, high caloric, easy food that tastes good, that make you feel better. So the emotional part of feeling better, for eating those things, is really part of that. Is your body responding to the drama of this situation, right? So, and all these things kind of feed into one another, right? So if you can establish, and then increasing your exercise habits is going to help you establish that routine. It's going to help you sleep better, and so on and so on. So these things are all really deeply interrelated.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that is 100% right. The more that you're able to do one of these things, the more you will be able to do one of the other things, and so on. I think that's a great point. So, however, keep your expectations realistic, right? So
Forgive yourself.
Right. Forgive yourself. Right. And so this is another part of it. I have heard, and so this, I will use myself as an example. In one of the earliest weeks of the quarantine, I drew up a block schedule for myself, and I said, I set every hour. I said, this is what I'm going to do during these hours. I have set aside times for breaks and exercise and work and things like that. And it just fell apart. And I knew, and I felt really badly about it. But I realized that I had to have a little bit more compassion for myself, and the fact that I tried really hard to set up a routine, but it was a little ambitious. It was a little ambitious to have every single minute of my day, categorized and sectioned off like that. And so I had to sort of know myself and back that up and say, okay, well, that form of establishing a routine is not working for me. Let's find a form that will work for me. And then I had to brainstorm and find some other ways. So if you, make an attempt to, enact some of these strategies and it doesn't work right away, that's totally fine. Give it another shot. Find a different way to do it. There's, there's more than one way to achieve this health during this time. So be gentle with yourself in that way. The other thing that I've heard, especially from academic friends of mine, is people feeling like, oh, well, I have all this extra time because I'm not going in. I should be able to write all these papers and, put in all these grants and do all these things I've been meaning to do. And this also, goes over to non-academics as well, right? We see a lot of people having very ambitious goals for, I'm going to learn how to bake bread, and I'm going to, I'm going to homeschool my kids and, work with them 8 hours a day. And, I think it's really important to understand that we are not just at home for the heck of it. We are at home because we're trying to avoid getting an illness, and it's not a regular time. So, keeping your expectations realistic is very important.
And that goes for the people in your life as well. So it adds a whole other layer of complexity when you have maybe sometimes children at home, and there might be grandparents at home, and especially for sort of a generation of a certain age, you might be raising children and caring for elderly parents. And so that can add another layer of complexity. And then you're trying to manage not just expectations of work, but expectations and the work of your children, expectations and the care of your adult parents or your elderly parents. And so all those things, get to a point where a person may be able to say, wow, here's what I thought we could do. But you add all this extra randomness, if you will, with other people in one's life. So for folks in those kinds of situations, and maybe the teachers that your children are working with, and they're trying to do things online. So all this sort of noise gets added into the system where everybody's trying to cope with this stuff. And you have to almost kind of recognize that there's a lot of stuff that's kind of beyond your control, right? And so allowing that to not go completely off the rails, but recognize that, especially if you're used to a situation where you can control things quite well, or have a very orderly life, we try, many of us try to get that way, but to recognize that you can't control all of it. And that gets back to that expectations, but realistic expectations, and also forgiving yourself, and also forgiving the people in your life who may be having difficulty with this too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things that Elliot and I are both really interested in our research is, as I was sort of alluding to earlier, is, why is it that some people deal with certain kinds of stressors and don't have a particularly difficult time, whereas other people do? And so you may have people even within your own home who are experiencing different levels of challenge with this situation, right? So some people may say, oh, it's fine, whatever, I'm dealing with it. Other people may be having a really, really challenging time. And so I think that it's important to allow for that, right? To acknowledge, like, everyone's experience isn't going to be the same, even within the same household. The next point here is to practice gratitude. It probably doesn't feel like there's a lot we can be grateful for during this time, because we focus a lot on the inconvenience and the things that we've lost, and we have lost a lot during this period of time. But I think it's also really important, and not only important for everyone, but good for you personally, to think about the things that you're grateful for, right? So maybe you live with people who you like, right? Maybe you're getting along with your family and you're spending more time with your family in a way that feels kind of nice. Maybe you're still able to work. Maybe you're still being paid. Maybe you have enough resources where you can, afford to, eat out once a week as a way to treat yourself. Maybe you live sort of nearby some of your relatives, and so it's a little bit easier to kind of do like a drive-by wave with your relatives, as opposed to being very, very far from them. So, definitely I think it's important. And as, Elliot was mentioning before, right, these things all go hand in hand. Practicing gratitude and acknowledging what you are grateful for does not mean that you are not struggling. Those two things can really coexist. It's hard for us sometimes to hold both of those things at the same time, but they really can coexist especially during these times of great challenge. And finally, be kind to yourself. So, this is all, we've sort of been talking around this point, but again, this is all part of keeping your expectations realistic and practicing gratitude. If you try something and it doesn't work, give yourself credit for the fact that you tried. If you have, one day where your kids don't learn anything, but they're still alive and they got fed and they seem reasonably happy, that's a victory, right? So give yourself a break. And not only because you deserve it, but also because if you don't give yourself a break, all of those other psychological outcomes that we talked about are just going to hit you a lot harder. So being tough on yourself during this time isn't always the best strategy. It's like most things in life, we have to find some moderation. I cannot, from this view, see the chat. Is there anything coming up in the chat, or?
I don't see it either.
Okay. And I mean, we can do questions at the end for sure. I just wanted to make
Sure.
sure somebody wasn't waiting with a very pressing question. But okay, so I'll just keep going then.
I pulled it up here, Sarah. It doesn't look like there's anything showing yet.
Okay, great. Okay, so we've been talking about sort of general strategies, how to, think about how to help ourselves during this time. So then how do we help our kids? Not only kids in our home, but kids, that we may know through other, avenues. So we have to remember that children's lives, of course, have also been highly disrupted, right? So they're not going to school, they're not engaging in their extracurricular activities, and they're not seeing their friends. And especially, and this will have a different effect on your children based on the effect it has will be dependent on their developmental stage, right? So for a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old, the fact that they're not able to see their friends may not be as impactful as it is for your 10, 11, 12-year-old, right, who has maybe a really exciting, burgeoning social life, right? That may feel especially limiting for them. And so, I think as parents and caretakers, it's important for us to recognize that our children are struggling as well. And so how can we help them in particular? So as Elliot was mentioning earlier, all of the strategies that I talked before, those can apply to your children. And I think especially, as Elliot was noting, the routines, right? So setting up a routine for our children, something that is not overly rigid, but at least they come to know what to expect. Even in even in non-stressful times like this, kids respond really super well to routines. They respond well to knowing what's coming next. And chaos has the opposite effect, which makes them feel not good, feel anxious and insecure. And so as much as we can set up some kind of routine for them that takes into account, all of these changes, that can be really, really super helpful. And again, I've heard from a lot of parents, things like, oh, my kids are watching a lot more TV than they used to, and I'm feeling really guilty about that. And certainly it probably is not a great idea for your kids to be parked in front of the TV for 8 to 10 hours a day. But, again, give yourself a break and give them a break, right? Because they are, having to struggle with the same kinds of cognitive demands that you are using, like the video technology and the online technology to learn. So if they watch an extra hour of television a day, it's probably not going to significantly impact their development. And actually, to the contrary, it may help to generate some calm in those moments when people are feeling frustrated and they're not ready to move on to the next thing. So, parents, try not to beat yourselves up too much about being a little more lax about those kinds of things during these times. The other thing that's really important to consider is that children's best teachers are the adults around them. And in this moment, that means, for the most part, their parents and, maybe other extended relatives who are in the home. And so the more that parents can adopt healthy strategies, self-compassion, et cetera, the more that children will see their parents doing that and pick up on those habits, right? If children see their parents kind of falling apart, which can happen occasionally, but if they see them falling apart pretty consistently, then children are going to not only feel scared and insecure about the situation, but also they may adopt some of those behaviors. So, it's really important for parents to kind of remain strong for their kids, but also acknowledge to their children, hey, this is a weird time. We're doing the best we can right now.
So one thing too, sorry, I just want to interject. One strategy you can do too, especially if you've got children that are school age or even younger, and they trying to get them to do certain tasks, that can add a lot of frustration in caretaking and so forth. So one trick sometimes is to give children a choice. They have to do a task, but they get to choose. So you can think about this as younger children have a choice of 2 things. You either can take a shower or you can take a bath. Right? So it's the washing part is going to happen, but you get the control of picking this or that. So maybe you say at this time you either have to do your math homework or you have to do your reading homework, or you have to do an art project, or you have to do it, and so there has to be something but then, and an older child could have more choices, and maybe you could have the choices laid out. This is another way of going about this. And it's not going to work all the time. But part of the problem with some of this stuff, and one of the biggest stressors that people experience, it's not just in human beings, but in animal research and so forth, is loss of control. It's a big, big thing. So even the illusion of control can be quite helpful. And so saying, well, you maybe you can't control the overarching experience, but within this experience, we can make some choices that we have a sense of control. And then setting up sort of certain things that might be, again, having a little bit of flexibility in this. But say, for example, if you said, okay, at 3 o'clock, we're going to do this thing on Thursday. Every Thursday, we're going to do this thing on Thursday. So, for example, it might be sitting down and reading a book with your child, or doing some other task, and then it's something the child can look forward to, or else, as Sarah mentioned before, about getting a certain treat. So if you're going to do takeaway, and you say, okay, on Friday at lunch, we're going to do a special takeaway, and gives young children and children of all ages really something to look forward to, and then try to stick to that routine a little bit. But giving the illusion of choice can be quite helpful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And what you just were saying, Elliot, would remind me of another thing, which is that, especially for younger kids, this may not come up the same way, but especially for kids, school age kids and older, they may be thinking about the things that they've lost, right? So we're coming up on the end of the school year. There are, things like field day and, end of semester activities that kids look forward to that they now cannot do. And so, as parents, we may decide, okay, well, today was the day that was supposed to be field day. And so as a treat, we are going to go get snowballs at Hanson's and, put together a little obstacle course in the yard or something, right? Sort of acknowledging that it's okay to feel sad and disappointed about things that you've lost as a result of all of this. But here's how we can try to sort of mitigate some of that and give you something so you still have something a little special, even if it's not the thing that you really wanted. And adults can do that for themselves as well, right? So, I think that all of these strategies really can work for both kids and adults. Okay. So the next thing is that, Elliot and I are coming to you today because we need your help. And so we've been talking today about strategies that adults can use to mitigate the negative effects of quarantine. We've talked about children as well. But it actually turns out that when you look at the scientific literature, there is very little data on understanding how children experience these sorts of conditions, quarantine and isolation conditions. And so something that we are trying to do is we're trying to get a better understanding of that. And we are particularly interested in what this experience might look like in Louisiana and the greater New Orleans area. One of the reasons that we're particularly interested in Louisiana, one, because we live here and we're interested in this area. But the other reason is because the greater New Orleans area has experienced a number of significant stressors, and some may even call them traumas, in the past 10 to 15 years, right? So perhaps most obvious or noteworthy being Hurricane Katrina in 2005, but even since then, other really significant natural disasters and hurricanes have come through this region. And so we're really interested in not only how are parents and children faring during this time, but also are the residents of Louisiana particularly vulnerable because they've experienced these previous traumas and stressors on this large scale that's kind of similar to what we're dealing with now. And so you can help us figure this out. So we are looking to get information from parents who live in Louisiana and have a child under the age of 18 who is currently living with you at least part-time. We are collecting this information via an online survey. And so we can send the link to that online survey, I think, via a follow-up email to this event, or I can put the survey into the chat box once we're done talking. We are, as most sort of university research outfits, we are operating on sort of a limited budget. And so you'll see that at the end of the survey, there is an option to select whether or not you would like to be paid for your participation. if you feel comfortable, if you can sort of afford, not to be paid, we would appreciate that, only because we're trying to reach as many families as possible. And there definitely are some families out there who really do need this honoraria that we're offering during this time. But if you feel that you could go without it potentially, we would be very grateful, because then the more we can get more people involved in the research, and the more people we get involved, the more we can learn. So Elliot, do you have anything to add to that?
So Sarah, I just wanted to mention that there might be families that have particularly unique situations as well. So some of the families I've been speaking to, I study children with a variety of different neurodevelopmental disorders, and one in particular is a chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome. These children have very complex medical, behavioral, and psychiatric profiles, and so parents have sort of the extra layer of coping with that. And sometimes child has things like autism or Down syndrome, or sometimes children have chronic illness like cancer and things like that. Those things add another layer of worry and fear and anxiety to parents and family members, oftentimes because you're trying to navigate the medical system during this complex time. And so, and then you have other circumstances where you might have families that might have a history of mental illness in their family, or a history of substance abuse, things like that. Maybe Sarah, if you could comment about families that have those kind of unique extra issues that they're coping with. So everybody's having a difficult time, but some people might have a particular diathesis, we'd say, that makes them more at risk for experiencing this event in a more stressful way. And maybe you could comment about resources or ideas for folks that are coping with those kinds of things.
Sure, absolutely. So, speaking first to the notion of people who have pre-existing mental health conditions, certainly what we know is that people who have pre-existing mental health conditions are much more vulnerable to the negative effects of all kinds of stress, but particularly this situation. So it is extremely important for people who have ongoing mental health problems to maintain any sort of treatment that they have been engaging in. So be that usage of medication, therapy, things like that. Fortunately, it seems that, at least my impression from speaking to people, is that the move to telemedicine has been a relatively smooth one. So most therapists are practicing online therapy at this point, either via video conferencing or via telephone, in the event that somebody doesn't have a computer or internet access. And so it is even more important than ever to maintain your mental health. When parents don't so it's important for adults just in general, but we also know that when parents have difficulties with their mental health that are uncontrolled or untreated, it certainly has a negative effect on children. And so, it's extremely important to make sure that you're keeping up with that treatment. In terms of, it may be difficult during this time. If you notice that you have emergent mental health problems, it may be difficult to secure new treatment, but it certainly is not impossible. And so, there are, again, a lot of clinics that are offering virtual visits. You can, one great way to get in touch with some of these kinds of specialized treatment is to go through your primary care physician. So, being in touch with them, letting them know that you're particularly struggling, and, going ahead and getting a referral. Often that can work effectively. There are certainly online resources. So National Alliance for Mental Illness has some workshops and different sort of electronic resources. There are other agencies as well that may have some guidelines. But I would say, for existing mental illness, the most important thing is to don't ignore it, because ignoring it does not make it go away. It certainly does make things worse.
And you'd also say the same thing about physical health. The brain, of course, is physical, so we think of mental illness as physical, but also, talking to your physicians about things like other medical issues. So one of the things you're seeing now in some of my colleagues in the medical field, and also in news reporting, is that people are avoiding going to hospital and avoiding going to doctors, and maybe putting themselves in jeopardy for acute emergencies like stroke and heart disease and heart attacks and things like that. So making sure that the fear of this COVID-19 doesn't preclude people from seeking medical treatment as well, especially in an emergency. So and that's really important because again, the hospitals are working really hard, and when you read the news, people get understandably quite anxious to read the news, and it can be quite scary. But hospitals, as overwhelmed as some of them have been, they're incredibly capable nurses and support staff and physicians and so forth, and they're going to make sure that people with acute care needs are going to get that care safely. So recognizing that yes, this is a scary time, but at the same time, there's some things that need to sort of override that anxiety, be it emerging mental health issues or ongoing mental health issues, and also ongoing medical issues too.
Yeah. And Elliot, something that you said also reminded me that I think that something that we're seeing is increased consumption of media. So people are watching the news a lot more, engaging in social media and things like that. And for both parents and children, it is very important to keep tabs on that, right? And so, as I was presenting earlier in the slides, one of the things that can make quarantine especially difficult is not having information, right? Is the uncertainty of when is this going to end and why am I doing this? And, that can certainly not help. And so we want both parents and children to understand to the extent possible, right? We don't know when this is going to end, but we have some understanding of why we're doing these quarantine procedures and things like that. So it is important to know that. However, there is a limit on the amount of good, high quality information that you can get from consuming news and social media. And so, and what we find is that it really makes people more anxious. And so I would say always, but especially during this time, be really mindful of where you're getting your news from and how much of it you're consuming. You will not avoid COVID-19 by watching, the news media, the news all day. There just simply isn't that much new information. So be mindful of that and how it's affecting you.
Yeah. The other part of it too is recognizing when you do read those things, how is it? So then also from a metacognitive perspective. So when you think about how you're thinking or think about how you're feeling, so when you're reading that, you say, am I reading this because it's interesting? Is it feeding my anxiety? Is it contributing to good feelings or bad feelings? And the other part of it too is sort of how one interprets others' behavior. And so we're going through a period of time now. Human beings, habituate. That's one thing that as Sarah mentioned before. This, people can adjust to a new normal. And what can happen is in the frustration of dealing with, extended shelter-in-place orders and things like that, people can say, "Wow, I really don't want to do this anymore," or "I'm feeling frustrated," or they start to sort of not really understand risk and how contagion works and so forth, and then start engaging in less social distancing and more trips and more unnecessary travel and so forth. And so then you get another aspect of that, which is recognizing that you may be putting yourself or others in jeopardy, but then also your feelings about those things. So you're going to start seeing more and more articles, I think, in the news and reporting of groups of individuals who are very angry at each other, right? So some people say there needs to be more social distancing. Some people say there needs to be less, and there's not a lot of clear conversations happening. There's a lot of bad feelings, and so recognizing how you're feeling about that as well, and saying, okay, is this the rational way to interpret this information that I'm getting, and is it making me really angry, or is this a healthy direction where I'm going emotionally as I read these things? And again, that gets back to the idea of understanding behavior in others and being forgiving of them as well, and saying, well, look, maybe there's people who are doing this thing that you're upset by have their own reasons. Okay, so how would we have a more effective dialogue? Because I think the social media platforms allow for a lot of vitriol and negativity, which again is going to contribute to the stress of the situation.
Yeah, and I think that we can learn. I think that's a great point, and I think we can learn a lesson from other conversations that people have had around sort of disagreements about large issues like this. It probably is not a great use of your time to try to argue with people who disagree with you about the way to conduct themselves and things, because people have different opinions, and it probably will only hurt you to try to convince an an unbelieving relative or friend that they should do things differently. So really, I mention keep up with your social connections and also be willing to sort of change the subject. If you're, speaking with someone who really doesn't, if you can't see eye to eye, now is not the time to resolve that, right? Find some common ground, talk about that instead, because it will only serve to make us feel more agitated and more frustrated about this situation. And there's already enough to feel frustrated and concerned about. Yeah.
And I think if you do get yourself caught in those situations, it's talking about how you feel, right? So
Mm-hmm.
say if I was upset with someone that I felt they were putting, someone in jeopardy and, by not social distancing or whatever, I might say, look, I'm worried about getting my family sick. I'm worried about you being sick, right? So it's less about, you're doing something bad or accusatory type thing. So you really communicating perspective, saying this is how I'm feeling, and it makes me anxious rather than angry about what's happening.
Yeah.
Right. So then it allows for an easier back and forth conversation.
Yeah. And I think related sort of to the survey that we're doing, we're asking people a lot of questions about, how has your family composition changed, right? Do you have new people living in your home? How are people in your family getting along, right? Because we know that not only are there individual factors like your own, mental health, but there's also sort of what we would think of as like dynamic factors, right? So how the family in general is coping with this situation. So we're interested in sort of all of these things and how they may, protect some people from the worst outcomes, but maybe lead to worse outcomes in other people. Yeah. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our talk here. Dr. Beaton and I are happy to take any questions about the content of the talk, the study, our own sort of individual work, whatever might be helpful.
And when this is all done, any alumni or any friends of alumni who'd like a tour of our facilities, we're more than happy to give them. So one thing that many people are surprised come to the Department of Psychology of all the cool equipment we have. We have all this really neat stuff to see it's not just empty rooms and classrooms and couches that people do dream interpretation on. We have some really neat stuff. And so we have, the chemistry laboratories, then we have physiology laboratories, and we have big mock-up MRIs, and these really cool behavioral observation rooms, all this kind of neat stuff that I think people are always pleasantly surprised and enjoy seeing when they come and give a tour. And of course, we are all very excited to talk your ears off about our work. And so besides the work that Dr. Black and I are doing, we have other folks in the laboratory, in the department, who are studying some really neat things, including how certain types of medications might be shaping brain development in animal models of autism, language and brain development in children with autism. We have another new faculty member who's very interested in very careful assessment, an accurate assessment of personality traits and how those things affect health. We have another faculty member who studies substance abuse and the things that affect shape early development and the likelihood of substance abuse and addiction. And then we have a new faculty member coming in who's going to be replacing me as the chair of the department, and he studies circadian rhythms, and that's another incredibly interesting area of research, looking at how circadian rhythms are changed that affect everything from your immune function to your sleep to your growth to illness and all these things. And one of the really cool things about our department is that we all have this intersecting interests. It's almost like a big Venn diagram. Remember the Venn diagrams, all those circles, and they overlap? So we all have this sort of our own areas of interest, but they all overlap, and every single one of us can be contributing to each other's work. So it's quite an interesting and exciting place to be. And so we'd love to show you this and potentially show you how opportunities, how you become involved. Any questions? I feel like I'm teaching now. I'm in a big class.
I know, right?
Any questions? Everybody's like this. If I could see your faces, I'd be calling on you right now. That's right.
Oh.
The lady sitting in the kitchen.
Yeah, exactly.
What does the nucleus accumbens do?
Yeah. Exactly. I'm glad I'm not actually needing to answer that right now. But that said, I thought this was really informative, and being in quarantine with my 8-year-old, a lot of good takeaways, both for me as well as for my attempts at scheduling him. And yes, I think moral of being forgiving of ourselves and compassionate with ourselves is a really good note to end on. So I really appreciate y'all being here and taking the time. It's great to have faculty involved in our virtual Meet-A-Sat events and engaging with our alumni in this way. I really appreciate it. So Francie, you'll be sending out an email. She can include the link to the survey. If any of y'all can participate, would be greatly appreciative. And join us for our next virtual Meet-A-Sat events. Okay.
Great.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all of you do
you.
As alumni. You're very much appreciated at UNO, and we're really excited to be able to get back in person, hopefully soon, and we'll see you all soon together.
That would be wonderful. Okay, thanks y'all. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks very
See
much.
everybody. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Bye.